Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Built by BIPOC. My name is Carrissa Begonia. I am the founder of Conscious Xchange. I'm a second generation Filipino American, daughter of immigrants, a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner specializing in Asian American identities and experiences, as well as a business and leadership coach for BIPOC professionals and entrepreneurs. So I started Built by BIPOC because I am tired of hearing that there isn't enough BIPOC talent out there. And I'm also really tired of being the first, the only other, often in spaces I tend to find myself in. So on this show, I highlight the journeys and practices of BIPOC entrepreneurs as well as company leaders who are claiming their seats at the table or building their own tables and advancing DEI at work. So I am so excited to introduce you all to my friend, Danielle Marshall. Hi, Danielle.
Hi, Carissa. It is great to be here with you. Thank you for having me on.
Danielle has been my business accountability buddy, and we just have such wonderful, rich conversations that I was like, "Hey, you should come join me on my weekly show." And so I'm honored that you're here with me today, and you agreed to do this because I know this is your
Thank you.
favorite thing to do, right, Danielle?
Yes, talk about myself. I live for it.
Well, I will talk a little bit about you first. So let me just do some introduction to Danielle. Danielle is an inclusive leader focused on strengthening collaboration among teams, leaders, and stakeholders to foster problem solving, create solutions, and improve culture. She finds inspiration in leading systemic change work that promotes equity and inclusion. Danielle has worked in the nonprofit sector for 20 plus years. Danielle went on to found Culture Principles in response to a persistent need to move organizations beyond DEI statements to develop strategic and actionable equity goals. Danielle holds a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology from Louisiana Tech University and draws on experience as an IO psychologist in applying a racial equity lens to organizational policies, practices, and programs. She's also a certified diversity professional, CDP, and executive coach, ACC. So thank you so much again for joining me, Danielle. And I'm excited to have this conversation about breaking through the noise.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carissa. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and maybe share a little bit more about yourself with the audience?
Sure. So just as a background on me, I know that we talk about culture a lot. And I was thinking about this question more broad strokes when I think about my own identity. I think it is a moment where it is both a source of pride for me and it's a little bit of angst. Because like a lot of African American people, I've been cut off from a lot of my larger history in this country, thanks to, the enslavement of my people. And, so when I think about where I sort of identify today, my family is also from the Caribbean. And so I feel like I have close ties to, we are from Barbados and Montserrat and Jamaica. And so that feels very, very present for me. But it is also sort of a moment where I am constantly finding that I need to reconnect to my identity because some of it has been lost over time.
I totally hear that. And it's a reclaiming an evolution even, and even the sadness that, right, like going through that grief of having, you said, like lost it and like having to assemble the pieces that you can when you can recover. I'm curious to learn a little bit more even about, the evolution of identity, how you maybe share who you are today versus maybe where you were. And because I think identity really is just foundational to work we do as equity leaders, right? How do we have to know ourselves really to also like understand how we operate in the world, right? So can you share a little bit more about maybe when you became more aware of your own cultural or racialized identity, and perhaps like what impact has that had on whether on your personal life or even your professional life?
Yeah, that feels like a big question, right? Because I think I was very aware of my racial identity as a child. So even early on, there was a lot of conversation in my family about like what it meant to be Black, and there was a lot of pride around it, and the cultural events that we engaged in, and there were certain things that were just always on display. My mother is an educator. She was before she retired, and she made a very strong point about making sure that I dove into my own history. So I went to predominantly white schools growing up. And so even in that moment, she's like, if there's a book report due, if there is a history lesson, you make sure that your focal point is going to be understanding not only our culture, but other cultures as well, so that it wasn't just one particular narrative. And so I was raised in a family that where pride again was surrounding Blackness, but I also had the experience of being that only Black student. Like there were times where I was the only Black child in my entire grade. And so, what my Blackness meant to other people started to take on a life of its own. And I have these distinct memories, and I know a lot of people of color do, and particularly Black people. We talk about this a lot, of having, gone to a store and I'm being followed around the store, or I'm walking down the street with a male, either relative or friend, and someone's crossing over to the other side of the street to sort of move away from us, and not even indiscreetly. And so I'm wrestling sort of with these narratives around what it means to be proud about my culture, but then also thinking about what it means in terms of how other people interpret it. And as a young person, I would say that's really hard to process. And you asked about the evolution, and I think there's still things to this day that I'm uncovering where I just haven't had maybe time to reflect on it. And now, because I'm in this world where I am, leaning on cultural competencies, I'm teaching about this, talking about it on a regular basis, and thinking more and more about culture, that there's some things that occur to me that I'm like, I hadn't considered that. And I'll give you an example. There in the Black community, we will often joke about CP time. Okay, so for people who might be listening that are not aware of what CP time, it stands for Colored People Time, right? And it's this idea that, Black folks will never be on time for things. So whether it is a personal event or it's a work event, we're going to be late to it, right? We may understand time more fluidly. But here's what struck me, I think, more in recent years, is we have joked about this for so long. But what in fact is funny about the way that we move through time? Some of us simply are not oriented towards clock time. But dominant culture is so persistent in saying this is the right way to go about things that our way of being becomes a joke. And so there are some things that I am now recognizing and releasing, because I'm like, that doesn't actually serve me. I can operate on clock time, and I can operate with the fluidity of the world in terms of that time. And both are right, and both are valuable. And so I think there are some shifts that I'm experiencing personally, as I sort of awaken to this deeper narrative that has always been there, but we don't always get to be conscious of it in the moment.
Yeah, I appreciate the acknowledgement of time. We talk about Filipino time in my culture too, and it's the same thing, right? Joking around that we'll be probably 2 or 3 hours late to anything. And I think time, especially more recently, as maybe we investigate, right, like white supremacy culture, and really interrogate that, like that is something that I'm definitely dismantling as something. Why do I have to be so steadfast in following and adhering to calendars and timelines and structures? That is important and necessary, can be helpful, and appreciating the fluidity of time as well, right? And what is that defined as? So thanks for sharing.
And I love that you added Filipino time, because I have heard it from Iranian people, from Puerto Rican people, from a host of folks. And so I'm thinking, if this is so common around the world, why do we adhere to one way of thinking here and make that the pinnacle of how we have to show up and how we have to act in the world?
Yeah. Food for thought here for those listening. Question around, again, more of the evolving of identity, right? And how that even has brought you potentially to the work you do today as an equity consultant. I don't know if that's something you started with. I know that you've been a leader in your nonprofit, in the nonprofit space for a long time. Is this something that kind of happened and found you, or did you choose to move into DEI type of work?
I feel like maybe it chose me, and I didn't even realize I was on this particular journey. So, I've shared before that I have worked in the nonprofit sector for over 20 years, and I have loved every moment of it. And I lived in a lot of different places around the country. So I lived in New York and Louisiana, and I'm in Maryland right now. DC. So I've been around, and primarily while I was working in nonprofits, I was traditionally serving Black and Brown communities. And the thing that really was pretty prominent in each of these communities that I was working with is this very persistent narrative about who our children were, what they would be able to achieve in life, who their families were, what they cared about, what they valued. And I just remember, sitting and listening to people talk about these communities, but they're not from them. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm on the ground every single day with these communities. I see the kids, I see their brilliance and their humor. I see the families, working extra hard. Maybe they're working 2 and 3 jobs because they care so deeply about their kids having better than they ever had. And I'm like, this narrative is not helpful for this community, nor is it accurate. Because what I really started to think about, so you mentioned in the beginning, like my background is in industrial organizational psychologist. And so for me, I tend to look at the world a lot through systems and human behavior and how we show up in the world. And I realize it isn't the kids that are the problem here. It is not the families that are the problem. It's the systems themselves. And so after having spent all of this time in nonprofits, and I will always love nonprofits, I have a heart for them. And I'm like, are we working on Band-Aid solutions to a much bigger, what I say is systemic problem? And that's how I came about to form Culture Principles, because I'm like, we have to stop throwing Band-Aids on things. We actually need to take action that's going to drive us towards some kind of change that's, on a systemic level.
So it's a journey, right? It wasn't like, hey, I'm going to go do this work. But I think like a lot of us, we uncover that, hey, like we've been doing this much longer than maybe our resumes or whatnot have shared, right? And it doesn't, it's not
100%.
named DEI. And do you think that's important in us in actually creating change in the world and effectively eliminating racism, right? Like, is it something that we have to say, hey, I'm a DEI person, consultant or whatnot, or what's everyone else's
Yeah.
responsibility in this?
Well, I think we all have a responsibility. Like, and here's the thing, like I was doing DEI all along. I did not have a title for it. I didn't even know there was a name for it when I started out. Like I'm fresh out of college, like I am working on narrative shift. I was working on thinking about how to, even adjust systems back then. There wasn't a name, at least in my understanding, for this work. It just simply was what we did. If anything, I called it social justice at that point. But it has evolved for me now. And I do think that there is some power in being able to name it today, because it is something that we absolutely need to focus on. But I don't think that you have to be a practitioner to walk this path. And one thing that I will mention, even about the word diversity, I don't know that we've had this conversation, but something that I was thinking about recently is I'm really bothered by how we use language sometimes, because I think it gets weaponized. And so right now, when I think about the word diversity in particular, diversity is being used on a daily basis to other people even further. Right? So diversity means that you are a different racial group other than white, that you are a gender that is not, a traditional gender in people's minds, that you belong to a religion perhaps that is not Christianity. It is a way to basically say there is a definitive line between us versus them in this moment. And it's challenging to me, because if you really think about the origins of the word diversity, it means all of us. And so if we are to continue to use that word in this way, there's power behind that also. I do understand that we need to name things, but we have to be careful that in the naming, we are also not excluding people.
Mm.
And I'm particularly thinking about this because there's been such a blowback from white people in general around I don't see myself in this. Why do we have to work on this? Why does this matter? And it's not all of them, for sure. I don't want to generalize there, but there's definitely been a pushback, and it's because you don't see yourself in it, because you're not named. Rising tide lifts all boats, and this is definitely one of those moments where if we can, support communities who have traditionally been marginalized and sort of help raise the level on outcomes for them, we all get ahead. It's not specific to one group.
Agreed. I think it takes everybody. And to your point, I think some folks, white folks, and racialized folks, like don't think is something that they have to take on. Like Danielle will take care of that, right? Or it's not my problem. And some folks can walk away from it, which is interesting, privilege and all that. Something I want to, what I love about talking to you is such a strong. You have such a strong stance. and positionality on things, right? Like even like the word diversity. How, I'm sure how you even define your work as a DI consultant and coach and leader. And so, would love to hear a little bit more about both the journey of leadership for you, and how you've defined that, or how to redefine that as you've grown in your career.
I feel like leadership has ebbed and flowed for me, just over time. Like I am thinking about, and we've had this conversation in the world for a long time around like getting a seat at the table. I think as a young professional, it felt very much like I was the only in so many ways, right? I was the only person of color in this organization. I am the only person in a leadership position, later on in a senior leadership position. So it was never a good feeling to look around and there's either one, possibly two of me represented. And so, as I was thinking about leadership then, I think it was both about what I needed to do to position myself to have a voice in the conversation, but also what I could do to uplift people, again, who did not necessarily have that seat. And it's interesting because, as I think about what the cost was to get a seat at the table, like I got pretty good about navigating that. I was able to get a seat in many tables, but there's a cost that comes with grabbing that seat. Because the cost for me and why I was acceptable is there was a time for me early, in particular in my journey, where I would say I assimilated. I spoke more like you. I looked more like you. I showed up in the ways that you valued as dominant culture. Those days are over for me personally. I don't seek to do that anymore, because one of the things that I realized about getting at the seat at the table is that we claw our way as communities of color, of people who are maybe non-binary or LGBTQ plus, et cetera, like whatever it is that makes you other in this moment to dominant culture. We're trying to get a seat at the table, and I was included in that. And I got to the table, and when I got there, I realized, I was like, I don't actually like what's on your menu. This isn't going to serve me in this moment. I'm looking for something else. And so now, as I'm exploring this more at this stage of the game for me, it is more about thinking, do I want a seat at the table? Do I want to build my own table? Do I want to have a table where I can invite other people to join? So I think there are a lot of things that have shifted in terms of my leadership, both my style and just what's important to me. There are so many moments where my leadership has been questioned. I was thinking about, just in preparation for this conversation, like some things that had happened. And I have a distinct memory of someone asking me, who was pretty senior, they asked me at what point I lost my voice. And that caught me off guard, because I'm thinking, I haven't lost my voice. It was like, if anything, my voice is stronger than it ever has been. And what I said to the individual in that moment is, I didn't lose my voice. I said, you've lost the privilege of hearing it. Ooh. And your reaction is exactly how I felt. I was like, ooh, I got a good zinger in. Until I realized, here's the challenge. If I do not add my voice to the conversation, we all lose. I lose the benefit of speaking my truth responsibly in this moment and living into my truth. And you lose the benefit of hearing a perspective and a lived experience that may not be yours. And so when I think about the transformation in terms of the journey, it is both about being able to say the things that are important, but also being able to reflect and grow as a result of those reflections into who you are ultimately to become. So now, Danielle, today will not step back from sharing my voice. So I have said already, even in this format, like this is different from me. I don't come on LinkedIn Live. I don't typically do this. And yet, when the challenge was issued to show up and talk a little bit more about myself, I said, well, let's lean in. Let's do this, because again, there is someone out there who may actually need to hear a message about how someone was able to navigate this.
100%. And again, when we were preparing for all of this, one of the things you said was that people say about you, that's often that's pretty common, is that your voice cuts through the noise, right? And I thought that was so interesting and powerful, that I'm like, that's a talent, that's a skill, that's something that's cultivated over time, say, and especially as someone who says they're an introvert, and is shyer on platforms like this, I'm like, wow, that's powerful, and absolutely, your voice needs to be heard because there are folks watching or just looking for someone to like you, that looks like you, right, or is like you, has experiences like you to relate to, and say like, oh, someone else is doing this. It's not so scary. I'm not so alone. And one of the things I'd, even love to hear some advice and tips and such around is how have you learned to cultivate that, and just say yes. I acknowledge that the introvert in myself is wants to go over there, and the shyer person wants to go in the corner and not show up. What are some tips, and how did you like really again cultivate that courage, or get that courage?
Oh, am I cultivating today, you mean? It's a journey, right? I'm still on that journey, and every day I try to lean into it a little bit more and stretch myself. But just going back to this idea of like, how does one's voice cut through the noise?
Mm.
Something that has more newly occurred to me, and I'm putting a lot of value on it, is that we need to think about leading with our strengths. I happen to be, yes, very introverted. So after this call, I probably will go, and take a walk by myself, and do something quiet. That is very much true. But I'm also someone who enjoys talking. So I really love to have, intimate conversations. I love a stage. Like these are things that feel really natural for me because I'm a talker. I like to have this dialogue. And so that was a strength for me, even growing up, as a child. It was always present. But when we talk about voice, what I really would want people to think about is our voice does not have to only be used in dialogue,
Mm.
right? If you are a writer, use your voice to illustrate something that is absolutely thought provoking. If you're a poet, write a beautiful piece of poetry. If you're a musician or an artist, your voice may come out in your artistry at that moment. If you're even someone who is a healer, let your work speak for you, right? There are so many ways to think about voice, and we again shift only to, one or two forms, and we say that is the way you need to sort of shake up the world. That's the way that you need to lend your voice to it. So I think the first piece for me, if I'm thinking about how other people might consider this for themselves, is what is natural for you? Where is your talent naturally emerging? The other piece of it is thinking about the audience. Not every audience is our audience, right? There might be someone that logged on today and they're listening to us and they tuned out already because they're like, we don't want to hear from her. Okay, that's not my audience in this moment. When we talk about cutting through the noise, we're often thinking about the masses, but your sphere of influence may look different. I need to make sure that my message gets to the people that I most care about in this moment. Who is it that I need to articulate this to? Who is ready and willing to hear this message in particular? Those are the people that I want to talk to. And then beyond even having the conversation with those people, those are the folks that are going to amplify your message. And so they're going to actually now go out and be champions of you in ways that you couldn't even have done yourself, because you not only have your sphere of influence, but you have their sphere of influence and the next person who hears this, right? It's how books get recommended to people and all these wonderful things. Like, so what are we, books and movies and all of this stuff? It's because a friend told a friend told a friend. This was valuable to me. So we don't always have to think about talking to everyone. Find your specific group of people and make that message count.
I love it. And maybe my last question is, when's your TED Talk?
Well, I am available if there are any TED organizers out there. I would love that.
Yeah, I so much of when we were again preparing for this was like, you have such a powerful like voice, and like things to share and say, and I just enjoy having conversations with you, and hoping that like just our own dialogue here with everyone, sharing this with folks, is can get a little inspiration as well. um, and with that, also on the show, as much as I love inspiration, I also really do think about what's a practical tip. And so as a DEI consultant, and or executive coach even, like what is, a very specific, maybe tangible, tactical recommendation or tip for folks, um, to actually take on the responsibility of equity work, regardless of identity.
Um, I think the tip that I would leave people with, and I'm actually working on a piece around this right now, is thinking about when it comes to DEI, when it comes to building your cultural competencies, are you a consumer or are you an actor? And the reason I ask that is, there are so many people out there that are reading tons of books, especially since 2020, right? They're reading all the books, they're listening to all the podcasts, they're sitting in conversations with one another. And so they've built this vast array of knowledge. And then they're still wondering, like, well, I've done all of the work. Why haven't things changed? Well, my big question as an executive coach to them is, what have you done with the information you have consumed? What looks different in your life, right? So if you read a book and you literally are like, oh, I finished that book in a week, it was great. You didn't take notes, you didn't take action, something is missing for you, then how are we expecting things to change, right? This is sustainable. This is not a one and done, like I read the book, therefore I have an encyclopedia, memory of this topic, and that I'm a changed person for that matter. No, I have to put the work in to actually see the change occur. And so, that's one thing that I really would want to leave people with is it's not enough to even, if you're hearing the sound of my voice now, if there's something that resonated with you, like, please, by all means, turn it into a goal for yourself, which is the next piece of it. In order to bring this to life, you have to understand why you're doing it in the first place. It's not because I said so or any other DEI practitioner. Why is it important to you? Because when it gets hard, that why is what's going to hold you up.
That is key to me as well. Like, it's the why. It's knowing what is the purpose. Because when things get hard, we have to go back to that, right? So thanks for sharing that, Danielle. Well, we are about to wrap up here. And before I wrap up, I do like to do a bit of a rapid fire round. So is that okay if we do that?
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. Are you ready? I wasn't supposed to.
Travel the world.
The future I am building is
one that is full of ease for my daughter and full of choices.
I am most grateful for.
I am most grateful for my community.
I am grateful for you, Danielle, for joining me today and for being in my community. We're relatively newer to each other, but it's been, I think, since we met.
Yes, absolute love fest.
That is my people's. Well, we are celebrating Black History Month. I was curious if you have anything special that you're doing for the month or anything else that you're excited about that you're working on that you'd like to share with everyone.
Sure. So I am going to do a plug for Reimagining Racial Equity first. It is an 8-week learning intensive that I do with my partner, Wendy Muma. And so we invite people to come in and register. So we're talking about all the things from a historical standpoint of racial equity to what does it mean to start to implement this in your business. And you can find out more information about that on my website, which is www.culture-principles, and that's principles.com. And then the second thing that I would say is, I am really stretching myself and getting out there and would love to be able to visit with more organizations, to be able to get on a stage, to talk about cultural competencies, to talk about this idea of why diversity matters for all of us. And what it might mean to re-envision the narratives.
Awesome. Yes. Certainly, we have some of your information in the event description. So if you're looking to connect with Danielle more, like look at her work, her website, it should all be there. And also the reason I do Built by BIPOC live and on LinkedIn is because of how easy it is to connect with folks. And so if there was anything that Danielle had to share today that was interesting and inspiring to you, I encourage you to reach out, to follow, connect. And yeah, with that, anything else you want to share, Danielle, before we wrap up?
No, I'm just immensely grateful for you and for the platform that you've built, because I do think if, as we talk about cutting through the noise, one of the ways
Mhm.
that we can continue to help each other cut through that noise is by uplifting one another. What would it look
Absolutely.
like if we could all be there in support of one another instead of just trying to tear people down? So thank you, Carrissa.
Absolutely. And thank you really truly for all the wonderful support and conversations that you've given me as well. And with that, everyone, thank you all so much for joining. Built by BIPOC is weekly. Replays are available. So when you see the next event pop up, you can hit attend so you can get notified of the replays if you can't join us live. Otherwise, you can also find the replays on the Conscious Exchange company page. So with that, I'm actually going to be taking a bit of a break to focus on a couple other things for the next few weeks. So we're not going to have a Built by BIPOC show next week, but definitely hit the bell on my profile, because then you'll be able to see what is going on in my world and when the next event will show up. So otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again so much, Danielle. And all I'll leave you all with for now is keep on building those communities, and because it's much more exciting to build together. All right, bye.